Hey everyone, I'm Phil Albertelli, and this, of course, is The Week in Doubt, and this is yet another viewer-requested episode. Here's the message they left in the comments section of the last episode. Request: Kubrick and the Beatles, Magical Mystery Tour, The Rainbow, The Bear Costume, The Shining, The Rothschild Baby Part Dinner, The Record Store in A Clockwork Orange, Under the Rainbow, Eyes Wide Shut, The Weird Baby Beatles album cover. I think there's something there, but who's got the time to do what you already do so well? Well, apparently flattery will get you everywhere, because here I am fulfilling your request. So a lot of weird, lurid topics, my specialty, and we're gonna try to sift through it all and see whether or not it's really all connected. And I have to say, I feel like I got lucky again with this request, because this is all right up my alley. I'm a big Kubrick fan. Magical Mystery Tour is one of my favorite albums, and once again, I just love weird stuff. So let's start by comparing the Bear Man costume from The Shining to or with the animal suits worn by the Beatles on the Magical Mystery Tour album cover. If you've ever seen Stanley Kubrick's classic film adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, you probably won't have any trouble recalling the bear costume scene. It's kinda hard to forget. A panicked Wendy Torrance ascends a flight of stairs and suddenly encounters an open hotel room door through which she sees a man in a creepy-looking bear costume kneeling, apparently performing a sex act on a man dressed in a tuxedo. The two men then turn their heads to stare eerily at a shocked and horrified Wendy. This scene appears in King's novel as well, but in the book version, the costumed man is dressed as a dog rather than a bear. It's also revealed once again in the book that the well-dressed man on the bed is Horace Derwent, who in life had been the owner of the Overlook Hotel, and the man in the dog costume is his lover, Roger, who Horace sadistically and publicly humiliates by making him wear the costume at one of the hotel's balls. The man wearing the bear suit in the film version was originally uncredited, but he's an actor by the name of Eddie O.D. and is listed on IMDb as having played the role of Roger-Man in bear suit. So it would seem, at least based on that the identities of the two men are probably meant to be the same as in the book, the hotel owner and his servile lover, Roger. The following is from a Screen Rant article. It discusses how Brian V. Towns, the actor who played the man in the tuxedo, comments on the scene in a 2019 YouTube video entitled The Shining: The Lost Interview. He admitted that when he was cast for the movie, he was told it was a small and quote-unquote rather rude scene. He then reveals he was told the other actor would be a bear, although he said he knew it was a dog in the book. Towns said that Stanley Kubrick chose him from casting photos and flew into England to shoot the scenes. Which makes sense, because I believe the majority of the interior shots were actually shot in England, while the majority of the exterior shots were shot in the States. In particular, the outside shots we see of the Overlook Hotel in the movie, that's actually the Timberline Lodge in Oregon, and yet the inspiration for the Overlook Hotel was actually the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. So, it gets kind of convoluted or confusing. But from what I could glean, it was Kubrick who personally made the decision to go with a bear costume instead of a dog costume for the film. Why exactly, I'm not sure, but according to a film scholar by the name of Rob Ager, it could be part of an attempt by Kubrick to imply that Jack may have been, trigger warning as the kids say, sexually abusing Danny, his son. According to Ager, Kubrick leaves a trail of breadcrumbs or visual clues throughout the film in the form of bear imagery. I'll now read a bit from that same Screen Rant article. The scene with the bear suit seems absurd and grotesque, even by the standards of the rest of the movie, but the Shining Bear Man does have a disturbing and specific implication. At first glance, the scene seems brief and somewhat inconsequential. The bear in The Shining has a lasting legacy, though, an especially unsettling moment, and an already unsettling film. In the scene, Wendy Torrance, Shelley Duvall, is roaming through the halls of the Overlook Hotel with a knife when she approaches a door at the end of a long hallway. Inside, a man in a bear suit is performing fellatio on one of the Overlook's guests. Wendy seems to be thoroughly disturbed by this and runs away. Despite being strange and somewhat out of place, the bear scene exists in the Stephen King Shining book too, but in the novel it's a man dressed as a dog. However, the animal suit scene in The Shining has symbolic relevance regardless of medium, bear or dog. Here's why. And it continues, film scholar Rob Egger delved into what Kubrick may have been implying with the Shining bear scene. It has provided one of the most thorough explorations. Stanley Kubrick's films are known for foreshadowing, as well as leaving behind clues that all signify some kind of deeper meaning, usually tethered to psychological conditions, phenomena, or theory. The Shining bear scene is no different, and if Rob Egger's theory is correct, could explain the much darker nature of the relationship between Danny Torrance, Danny Lloyd, and his father Jack Torrance, Jack Nicholson. It seems ridiculous on the surface, but Egger's in-depth analysis points to some very compelling evidence of sexual abuse. One of the most persuasive is the recurrence of the Shining bear symbolism. During the scene where Danny is speaking to his psychiatrist, he is lying on stuffed bears. At the Overlook Hotel, there's a picture of two bears above Danny's bed, and there's a prominently featured bearskin rug in the lobby. This provides a clear association between bears and Danny Torrance. Keen-eyed viewers have pointed out that the issue of Playgirl magazine Jack Torrance is reading has an article titled Incest: Why Parents Sleep with Their Children featured on the cover. Connecting the dots, the two figures seen in the Shining bear scene could be stand-ins for Danny and Jack. I'll be sure to include an image in the YouTube version, because that's a kind of twisted Easter egg that fans of The Shining have known about for a long time, including myself. There's a scene where Jack Torrance, Jack Nicholson's character, is sitting in the hotel lobby casually reading a magazine while he's waiting, and the magazine he's reading is indeed an issue of Playgirl. And that Screen Rant article is correct. On the cover, it mentions that one of the articles contained within is about incest. Fingers crossed I don't get demonetized. Egger, or the article, also speculates that Wendy's reaction to the Bear Man encounter may represent her horror at the realization of the abuse Jack has been subjecting Danny to. And it's funny, I thought the name Rob Egger sounded familiar. I was wondering in passing if it might be a certain YouTuber I sometimes watch, who offers in-depth film analysis, and it is. His channel is called Collative Learning, I think it is. A good channel, by the way, you should subscribe. That being said, as darkly compelling or thought-provoking as it might be, I'm honestly not sure how widely accepted or accurate Egger's theory is. And that's not me rhetorically trying to cast doubt. I'm honestly not sure. I think it's a smart and insightful theory either way. I tried to find out what became of the bear suit, but it seems to be something of a mystery. Apparently there's no records regarding its whereabouts, and some speculate, as is often the case with props, once the filming was complete it could have simply been disposed of or sold off to a collector at some point. But now for the Beatles costumes. I have to admit, when the person who requested the episode mentioned both the bear suit from The Shining and the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour animal costumes, I thought, oh yeah, they are similar, to the point where I found myself wondering if they may have actually used one of the Beatles suits in The Shining. Then I went and checked out the Magical Mystery Tour cover for the first time in a while, and was suddenly reminded to my embarrassment that none of the Beatles are actually wearing a bear costume. In fairness, though, the style of the costumes is pretty similar. And in a little bit, I'm gonna get to the topic of where the Beatles actually got the suits. It was in England, and since the interior shots of The Shining were mostly shot in England, it makes me wonder if perhaps the costumes came from the same place. Admittedly, 100% pure speculation on my part. From what I've read, both the idea for the Magical Mystery Tour project in general, the film and album concept, as well as the idea of having the band don animal costumes, originated with Paul McCartney. McCartney's concept was at least partly inspired by Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, which I thought was pretty cool. I hadn't previously been aware of that fact, but I'm a big fan of beat literature and aspects of 60s counterculture, and Kesey, who is also an author and wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is famous or infamous for his counterculture escapades. He led a band of LSD-fueled hippies known as the Merry Pranksters. They threw acid parties, handed out LSD, and drove around in a psychedelic bus with the word "further" written on the front of it. If you want to learn more about Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, read Tom Wolfe's book, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. But anyway, apparently this is where McCartney, at least in part once again, got the idea for traveling across country in a psychedelic bus filled with friends, etc. Regarding the animal costumes, despite later singing The Walrus Was Paul in the White Album song Glass Onion, it was actually John who wore the walrus costume. Ringo fittingly was dressed as a parrot, although I also heard it, probably wrongly, described as a chicken costume. Paul was the hippo and George was dressed as the bunny, or more accurately, the March Hare. I also found myself wondering if the Beatles' animal costumes were still around. I assumed a band as successful as the Beatles probably would have had the costumes specially made for them, but I learned to my surprise that they simply rented them. I found an image of the original invoice or receipt online. The costumes were quote-unquote hired for the band by their late manager Brian Epstein's company NEMS Enterprises from a London costume shop called the Theatre Zoo that specialized in masks and costumes for theatrical productions. The costumes were rented for 1 week, long enough to utilize them for the I Am the Walrus segment of the Magical Mystery Tour film. It's thought that after being used, they were simply returned. And for some reason I found this amusing, but apparently the Beatles couldn't quite decide in the moment which animal costumes they want to use, so they rented a bunch of them. Here's the breakdown from the invoice. 1 walrus mask, hood, feet, and flippers. March Hare mask and hood. Wolf, hippo, gorilla, parrot, lizard, fish, frog half, and frog full. And at the bottom of the invoice it says collected 15th of September, in possession. And I noticed towards the top right corner of the invoice, stamped in pinkish or red ink, it's marked the 27th of September, and so I don't know if that was when the costumes were returned and then they stamped them to mark they had been returned, or if that's when they were expected to be returned. Because then lower down it's marked the 25th of September in black ink, which looks like it was typed, so not sure. The cover of the Magical Mystery Tour album was designed by the head of Capitol Records' art department, John Van Hammersveld, I think it is, utilizing artwork provided by EMI. There was concern at Capitol due to the fact that this would be the first time ever that the band would have their faces covered on the front of an album due to the animal costumes. To try to offset this problem, Van Hammersveld, once again I think, employed the garish style the album cover is now famous for, and attempted to draw special attention to the song titles by displaying them in relatively large Art Deco-style lettering above the band's heads and beneath the Magical Mystery Tour rainbow film logo. I tried to find out who designed or came up with the idea for the rainbow logo, but didn't have much luck. I mention it because rainbows are really gonna come into play a bit later. So as far as I can tell, there's not necessarily any obvious connection between the Shining Bear Man costume and the Beatles' animal costumes, other than they look stylistically similar, but as alluded to by the viewer who requested this episode, a physical copy of the Magical Mystery Tour album does appear in Kubrick's film A Clockwork Orange during the record store scene. It's prominently displayed on a shelf above the cashier or clerk's head when Malcolm McDowell's character Alex is at the counter, and down lower to Malcolm McDowell's right near the bottom of the screen is the soundtrack to Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I only spotted it after someone else pointed it out, but Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother is visible as well. From what I can tell, making these specific albums visible was a deliberate choice by Kubrick, at least regarding Magical Mystery Tour and 2001. The choice to add a nod to the Magical Mystery Tour may have been Kubrick having a playful poke at the Beatles, because apparently without asking him first, the Beatles had utilized unused footage from his film Dr. Strangelove for the quote-unquote flying scene in their Magical Mystery Tour film. They were lacking footage for the scene, and their video editor, a man by the name of Ray Benson, had access to the footage stored at the studio where Dr. Strangelove had been filmed. Supposedly, Kubrick was so upset that he called Benson personally to complain about it. Now let's jump to Eyes Wide Shut. Now we're really going to get into rainbows. Don't think there's any connection to the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour rainbow, but oh, there will be rainbows. And here's a quick, comical, self-deprecating story. I can remember when Eyes Wide Shut first came out. I was young and stupid, and it was being billed as Stanley Kubrick's haunting final masterpiece. I turned to my friend and I said with an attitude, "How do they know it's gonna be his final masterpiece?" And he simply replied, "He's dead." Yeah, I felt stupid. Unbeknownst to me, Kubrick had passed away about 4 months before the film was released from a massive heart attack. One of the most fascinating things I learned while researching this episode is that Eyes Wide Shut is actually based on a book. Not only that, but a book from the 1920s, which I found somewhat surprising given the rather lurid or erotic nature of the story, and Kubrick didn't really need to spice things up. The book was already pretty racy to begin with. The author, Arthur Schnitzler, a fairly prominent playwright and dramatist of the day, was known for his frank approach to sexuality. The biggest change Kubrick seems to have made is changing the setting from the author's native Vienna to New York. The particular Schnitzler novel that Eyes Wide Shut is based on is entitled Dream Story or Dream Novel, or in German, Traumnovelle. I also heard Traumnovel, but Traumnovelle seemed to be more common, so let's go with that. It was published in 1926, and yet was still considered an example of the decadent movement prevalent in Western Europe in the late 19th century. If you're familiar with Eyes Wide Shut, you'll be familiar with the basic plot of Traumnovelle, or Dream Story. Spoilers, it tells the story of a successful doctor in his 30s, whose life is upended after his wife admits to having sexual fantasies about another man. He goes out into the streets and embarks on a transformational journey spanning 2 days that will ultimately lead him back home. But first he has to survive a dangerous descent into Vienna's dark underbelly, where he encounters an elitist secret society that engages in mass orgiastic sex parties. Schnitzler, who passed away due to a brain hemorrhage in 1931, was of Jewish ancestry and openly denounced anti-Semitism. Hitler disparaged his work, which the Nazis would ban in both Austria and Germany, as quote-unquote Jewish filth. Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, organized book burnings in which the works of Schnitzler were burned alongside those of other Jewish authors and luminaries, such as Einstein, Kafka, Marx, and Freud. Sadly, Schnitzler's daughter Lily had taken her own life in 1928. But his son Heinrich left Austria for the US a decade later, following the Anschluss, the German annexation of the federal state of Austria in 1938. Eyes Wide Shut wasn't the first adaptation of Dream Story or Traumnovelle. There was an Austrian television adaptation in 1969 and a 1989 Italian film version entitled Nightmare in Venice. Apparently, it was Kubrick's second wife, Ruth Sobotka, who had brought Traumnovelle to his attention. The following is from a Medium article. Eyes Wide Shut was adapted from a 1926 Arthur Schnitzler novel called Traumnovelle, Dream Novel, which Kubrick had first been turned on to by his bohemian second wife, Ruth Sobotka, who turned him on to so much about sex and psychology and aesthetic taste, while Kubrick taught her about film and chess. She broadened his cultural horizons even further, opening him up not only to dance but to art and literature as well. These had already been interests of Kubrick's, of course, but under Ruth's tutelage, his interest acquired a new depth and sophistication. In a 1960 interview, Kubrick said the following regarding Schnitzler: "It's difficult to find any writer who had a more profound insight into the way people think, act, and really are, and who had a somewhat all-seeing point of view, sympathetic if somewhat cynical." Kubrick finally acquired the rights to Schnitzler's novel in 1968 while working on 2001: A Space Odyssey, so roughly 30 years before he would finally make the film adaptation we know as Eyes Wide Shut. But he had never forgotten about the project and maintained an enduring admiration for Schnitzler. In 1972, he said, "Traumnovelle is a difficult book to describe. What good book isn't? It explores the sexual ambivalence of a happy marriage, and it tries to equate the importance of sexual dreams and might-have-beens with reality. All of Schnitzler's work is psychologically brilliant, and he was greatly admired by Freud." But let's finally get to the rainbows. And when I first read the viewer's message where they mention Under the Rainbow, the first thing that came to mind is the old raunchy comedy from the 80s about little people called Under the Rainbow. It starred Carrie Fisher and Chevy Chase. But the rainbow is a consistent theme throughout Eyes Wide Shut, and there's even a costume rental shop that has a big sign that reads Rainbow with a bright rainbow graphic above it, and underneath that signage it reads in kind of harder to read, somewhat obscured by shadow lettering, Under the Rainbow, and it's as if that part of the shop is lowered down or partially submerged below street level, which I think is rather powerful imagery. Because if I understand correctly in the film, the rainbow represents the fantasy, the illusion that the main character is pursuing. And so the partially sunken part of the store could be seen as representing what's under the rainbow, the dark underbelly or underworld he's going to encounter, and that will threaten to swallow or destroy him as he pursues his desires. It could also be seen as representing the shadow self or the unconscious, or one's more dark or forbidden desires. There may also be an aspect where the cherry brightness of the rainbow symbolizes a deceptive facade or unattainable ideal, the veneer of the perfect marriage, etc. Early on in the film, the main character, Bill, played by Tom Cruise, is at an event with his wife, played by Cruise's then real-life wife, Nicole Kidman. Bill is approached by two attractive young women, models, who try to flirtatiously lead him away, while his wife is on the dance floor with an older man who's interested in her. Bill asks, "Ladies, now where exactly are we going?" Exactly. One named Gail replies, "Where the rainbow ends." Bill responds by asking, "Where the rainbow ends?" The other girl, Nuala, asks, "Don't you want to go where the rainbow ends?" And Bill responds, "Well, now that depends where that is." Gail says, "Well, let's find out." But just then, Bill is pulled away by a patient who is also the host to attend to a hooker who's experiencing an overdose. Where the rainbow ends could mean finally satisfying or pursuing or attempting to pursue the fantasy to its end, finally attaining the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. In this case, we're dealing with the main character's sexual fantasies or desires, which the two young models seem almost too eager to satisfy, which perhaps foreshadows or hints at the looming danger waiting under the rainbow. Bill encounters an old med school buddy by the name of Nick, now working as a pianist. Nick tips him off about one of these secret orgies he'll be playing at, but cautions him that he'll need a costume, and that's where the aforementioned rainbow costume shop comes into play. It's been speculated that Kubrick may have chosen to set the story during Christmas time, at least in part so he could utilize the decorative Christmas lights seen throughout the film to keep the rainbow theme going, and to play with and contrast the colors, the greens and blues, the reds and oranges, etc. For instance, lighting seems to be used to represent or emphasize the divide in the relationship of the married couple at the center of the story. A cool blue seems to be used to light or represent Bill, played by Cruz, and a warm orange seems to be used to light or represent Alice, his wife, portrayed once again by his real-life wife at the time, Nicole Kidman. I've even read some theorizing that you could read Jungian symbolism about the intellect versus the anima into it if you wanted to. Not sure how accurate or not that is. We know Kubrick was very deliberate about his choice of color and lighting for each scene. We could go on a whole digression about the techniques Kubrick used to achieve the specific lighting and mood he was after, from forced developing film to the use of gels and tungsten lighting, etc. But I'm trying to keep this episode from getting too lengthy. And spoilers for those who have never seen the film, near the end, after Bill survives his journey over or under the rainbow, he returns his costume to the shop. And there's a small yet provocative detail that's very interesting. We can see the shop door with its glass window with the rainbow logo on it, but because of the way the door is facing, or we're facing the door, it appears that the logo is backwards or reversed. I'm not sure whether or not there's any intentional symbolism there, but I'm sure there's a lot you could read into it. And so Bill's costume had come with a mask, but he doesn't have it on him to return, and he asks, quote unquote, "Can you just put it on the bill, please?" Bill once again being his name. And the explanation I read in a Screen Rant article, or this particular theory, was that it can be seen as Bill claiming ownership of his shadow self, which I found to be a very powerful idea. To be honest, I don't know if there's any relationship at all, once again, between the magical mystery tour rainbow and the prevalent rainbow theme or imagery in Eyes Wide Shut, but as already covered, there's definitely a connection between Kubrick and the magical mystery tour in the form of the album's appearance in A Clockwork Orange, and the fact that footage from Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove is actually used in the film version of Magical Mystery Tour. Next, I guess we'll move from Eyes Wide Shut to the controversial Rothschild event the viewer alluded to. That seems fitting. Eyes Wide Shut deals with shadowy elites and ritualistic orgies, so why not jump from that to the Rothschilds, a wealthy and powerful banking family that's often the subject of lurid rumors and conspiracy theories, etc. And well, this will blow your mind. I double and triple checked the facts just to make sure it was real, and it appears it is. The orgy scene in Eyes Wide Shut was apparently filmed at Mentmore Towers in England. A grand-looking English country house, almost looks like a castle in Buckinghamshire, built for the Rothschild family in the 1850s. So it's safe to say, yes, there is a connection between the Rothschilds and Eyes Wide Shut, or Kubrick. Apparently it's a pretty common filming location, though. Other movies that have been shot there, or at least in part, include the 1985 film Brazil, Quills with Geoffrey Rush. I should do an episode on the Marquis de Sade someday. The Mummy Returns, Ali G in the House, Inspector Morse, and a bunch of other crap. I assume what the viewer was referencing when they mentioned the Rothschild baby part dinner, as they called it, is the notorious 1972 Surrealist Ball hosted by Baroness Maria Elena de Rothschild. I encountered the claim online that the Surrealist Ball was also held at Mentmore Towers, but this doesn't appear to be the case. It was held at Chateau des Ferrières, I think that's it, kind of like derriere, another Rothschild estate built in the 1850s, but outside of Paris. The Baroness's husband, Guy de Rothschild, who is also her third cousin, had been raised at the chateau, but had been seized by the Germans during the Second World War, after which it had remained empty until 1959, when Guy de Rothschild and the Baroness, then newlyweds, decided to reopen it. The Baroness took to refurbishing the massive chateau and soon began hosting parties, charity events, and themed balls, where European nobility mingled with artists, celebrities, famous musicians, and fashion designers. The theme of the 1972 ball in question was obviously surrealism. None other than Salvador Dali himself was in attendance, and had even personally designed some of the costumes, although pushing back against conformity as usual, he himself simply wore a suit that night. The guest list included an interesting mix of bankers, politicians, artists, and celebrities. The invitations listed the dress requirements as quote-unquote black tie, long dresses, and surrealist heads, and they were written backwards, requiring a mirror to be read. But in fairness, the text was also repeated on the back in normal left-to-right lettering. Among those in attendance were famous actresses Grace Kelly and Audrey Hepburn, who showed up with a birdcage on her head, both women being friends of the Baroness. Also, there were French actress Brigitte Bardot and supermodel actress Marissa Berenson, who would go on to be cast in Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon. Kubrick himself was not at the ball. And Dali wasn't the only famous artist in attendance that night. Apparently, Andy Warhol was there as well. The guests were attended to by servants dressed as cats, who led them into the party or into the dining room through a disorienting maze. Here's a couple of quick paragraphs from an All Things Interesting article, and I apologize if some of it is a bit redundant. Guests were ushered into a maze of cobwebs, with helpful quote-unquote cats leading lost guests to their tables. I'm trying to keep it together. The dinner plates were fur-covered, and the tables were littered with plastic baby dolls and taxidermied tortoises. Menu items included quote-unquote sir-loin, soup described as extra lucid, and goat's cheese roasted in post-coital sadness. Dessert was a nude woman made entirely of sugar, which was laid on beds of roses. Of course, the costumes worn by attendees were just as bizarre. While he designed many of them, surrealist painter Salvador Dali didn't wear one himself. Maria Elena, for her part, wore a giant stag's head adorned with real diamonds. And there's other bizarre details. Not only were the plates covered in fur, but everyone's forks were also accompanied by a dead fish, and some of the food was apparently served atop of a quote-unquote mannequin corpse. Seeing as mannequins are inanimate objects, I'm not sure why it's being referred to as a corpse. Maybe I'm overthinking it. And the article I read from also mentions the baby doll parts that the viewer referenced. And I'll include images in the YouTube version. Even though they are just dolls, it is pretty disturbing looking. And I'll say I totally get why people would see or hear about this kind of stuff and wonder if there's something sinister behind it. My guess is it's just highbrow, artsy, fartsy stuff, the product of bringing eccentric artists and high society elites together. I doubt the Baroness, which makes me think of G.I. Joe, or Dali, or Audrey Hepburn, or the other attendees are or were secretly members of a satanic baby-eating cabal. I can't say for certain that none of them were Satanists. LaVeyan Satanism was a thing at the time, and there were some celebrities who hobnobbed with LaVey. Although LaVeyan Satanists don't eat or sacrifice children, they're non-theistic Satanists who don't even believe in the literal devil. I'm just saying you could just as easily explain stuff like this as the work of hoity-toity, avant-garde eccentricism without bringing conspiracies about satanic cabals or demonic demonic elites into it, but admittedly this is just speculation on my part, and I don't know with certainty what each of these people were getting up to behind the scenes, or what was in their hearts and minds, or what their personal philosophies were. And once again, I get how messed up the optics are, and why it all feeds into conspiracies about satanic baby-eating elites. I'm a bit of a weirdo artist type myself, and it's a bit too much for me. I think some of the costumes were pretty cool, but if I went to a party and had to deal with fur-covered plates, dead fish, and plastic baby parts, I'd be like, why? Why can't we just eat and get drunk like normal people? I'd rather not have broken dolls and dead tortoises littering the table. And I brought up Satanism because while researching this episode, I encountered the idea that some conspiracy theorists interpret some of the symbolism or imagery associated with the surrealist ball as being satanic. One example I encountered multiple times was the idea that the backwards writing on the invitations is satanic because Satanists like inversion. That's one possibility, or it could be it's a surrealist ball and they're just trying to be weird or different or upend or invert norms for surrealist effect. I don't know. The images from the party definitely do give off some Eyes Wide Shut vibes, though, and unfortunately, Kubrick's no longer around to ask, but I wonder if he had that ball in mind at all when he was working on Eyes Wide Shut. He did choose to shoot at Mentmore, which is also a Rothschild estate, but on the other hand, the idea of masked elites engaging in perverse orgies was already present in Arthur Schnitzler's Traum novella, or dream story, or dream novel, on which Eyes Wide Shut is based. Not necessarily mutually exclusive, I suppose. He still could have been influenced by the Rothschild parties or the Surrealist Ball in particular to some degree. Okay, one more jump. Now let's go from baby doll parts to more baby doll parts. The viewer in question also asked about the creepy Beatles baby doll album cover. It's infamously known as the Butcher cover. It was the album cover of their 1966 album Yesterday and Today, and features the Beatles clad in white butcher coats, playfully looking into the camera while draped in slabs of raw meat and dismembered baby doll parts. And I remember when I first became aware of the album cover and saw it online, my mind kind of went numb and I had to do a double take. I'd always been a fan of the Beatles' more psychedelic stuff and then their later heavier stuff like Helter Skelter, etc. And so I knew they weren't exactly the squeaky clean lads that they were originally made out to be, but it was still kind of a shocking juxtaposition to see the smiling Beatles draped in slabs of bloody raw meat and plastic baby parts. And I think, to be fair, that was actually the photographer's intention. The following is from a Rolling Stone article about the cover. My original idea for the cover was better. Decapitate Paul, John Lennon once cracked while discussing Yesterday and Today, a 1966 collection of assorted recent Beatles tracks, cobbled together for the North American market. Joking aside, his concept is almost tame, compared with the photo that ultimately graced the LP upon its release that June. Fans seeking the aggressively inoffensive hit Yesterday, name-checked in the title, were shocked to find a grotesque tableau starring the group clad in white butcher coats, snickering like naughty, murderous even schoolboys, while draped in slabs of raw meat and cigarette-burned doll parts. Lennon could have drawn and quartered his bandmates, and it might have inspired less outrage. Half a century later, the image of a cheerful Fab Four posing post-baby slaughter remains unspeakably bizarre. Though the cover was immediately withdrawn, the fact that it was produced at all is a testament to the band's unprecedented status. You couldn't show a toilet seat on an album cover in 1966, and it would be a decade before punk rockers approached this level of public provocation, yet there sat the Beatles, gleeful among the carnage. And it continues, the so-called Butcher cover vaulted an otherwise unremarkable record into rock infamy and spawned what George Harrison once called, in quotes, the definitive Beatles collectible, worth tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. Still, the cover remains one of the most misunderstood chapters in the band's chronicle. Was it their comment on the Vietnam War, a protest against their record company, a publicity stunt, a sophomoric prank by bored rock stars? The truth is more complex. The image was the brainchild of Robert Whittaker, a 26-year-old Australian photographer whose dark humor and love of the surreal made him one of the band's favorite cameramen. Responsible for some of the most striking images of the group, Whittaker won particular praise for his whimsical 1965 portrait of John Lennon, posed with a dandelion over one eye, drawn from the Greek myth of Narcissus, and a quote from Euripides. The image beautifully captured the Beatles' idiosyncratic sensibilities. When the group arrived at his studio in London's hip Chelsea neighborhood on March 25, 1966, the well-read Whittaker had a more ambitious concept in mind. And here's a quote, "I got fed up with taking squeaky clean pictures of the Beatles, and I thought I'd revolutionize what pop idols are," he told author John Savage. Having personally witnessed the biblical level of Beatle adulation, including their record-breaking concert at Shea Stadium, Whittaker was inspired to create a satirical photo series that would address the absurd degree of their fame and remind fans that these rock deities were actually flesh and blood. Here's another quote, "All over the world, I'd watch people worshiping like gods for Beatles," he explained. "To me, they were just stock standard normal people, but this emotion that fans poured on them made me wonder where Christianity was heading." So apparently both Whittaker and the band got along and shared similar sensibilities. They both had a dark sense of humor and an appreciation for avant-garde art and surrealism, and both wanted to shake things up. And here's a quote from an interview John Lennon did with Playboy. "It was inspired by our boredom and resentment at having to do another photo session and another Beatles thing. We were sick to death of it." The Butcher photo was originally intended to be the center image of a triptych that would form a kind of gatefold-style album cover spread. Whittaker entitled the concept A Somnambulant Adventure. However, contrary to Whittaker's vision for the image, the Butcher image simply became the cover of Yesterday and Today, as mentioned, a kind of cobbled-together anthology record. As mentioned earlier, the Butcher cover version of the album was quickly withdrawn due to its controversial nature and public reaction, including retailers who found it distasteful, and apparently even some disc jockeys were outraged by the cover. Capitol Records had printed 750,000 copies of the album with a controversial cover, with 60,000 copies sent to radio and print media. They launched something called Operation Retrieve in an attempt to recall all the copies sent out to distributors, as well as related promotional materials. This effort ultimately cost the company about $250,000, well over $2 million in today's money. The Butcher photo would be replaced by a relatively innocuous image of the band members standing around an open steamer trunk. And despite the actual impetus or inspiration for the image or photo shoot that spawned it, at least some of the Beatles would try to spin or justify it as being an anti-war statement. Paul had claimed it was quote-unquote their comment on the Vietnam War. He also characterized their critics as quote-unquote soft. And John said the Butcher sleeve was, in quotes, as relevant as Vietnam. If the public can accept something as cruel as the war, they can accept this cover. I agree totally. Harrison would later go on to describe it in retrospect as gross and stupid, saying sometimes we all did stupid things thinking it was cool and hip when it was naive and dumb, and that was one of them. So is there a connection between the Rothschild baby part dinner and the Beatles' controversial Butcher cover? Maybe a weak or tenuous connection, in the sense that both the 1972 Surrealist Ball and Whitaker's Butcher cover image were influenced by the aesthetics and sensibilities of the Surrealist art movement. It's interesting that it manifested in both instances as tableaus involving dismembered doll parts. And I'm back through the magic of editing. I did find another connection of sorts at the last minute. One of Whitaker's influences was a German-born Swiss surrealist named Merit Oppenheim. Hopefully I'm not butchering that. Butcher cover pun not intended. Her most famous work being her 1936 piece entitled Lunch and Fur, in which she covered a cup, saucer, and spoon entirely in fur, which makes me think of the fur-covered plates at the Surrealist Ball. And here's a quote from Whitaker. It's an apparent switch around of how you think. Can you imagine actually drinking out of a fur teacup? I did a photograph of the Beatles covered in raw meat, dolls, and false teeth. Putting meat, dolls, and false teeth with the Beatles is essentially part of the same thing. The breakdown of what is regarded as normal. The actual conception for what I still call somnambulant adventure was Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. He comes across people worshiping a golden calf. All over the world, I'd watched people worshiping like idols, like gods. 4 Beatles. To me, they were just stock standard normal people. But this emotion that fans poured on them made me wonder where Christianity was headed, or heading. So, once again, a bit of that same quote there. I have to admit I unintentionally lied. There is one more Wild Beatles Kubrick connection. In the 1960s, a man by the name of Dennis O'Dell, who had helped produce some of the Beatles' previous film projects, knowing that they were Tolkien fans, suggested that they should do a musical film version of The Lord of the Rings. They loved the idea, especially John, whose job it would be to find a director. It would star Paul as Frodo, Ringo as Sam, George as Gandalf, and John as Gollum. They even had the execs at United Artists on board. There were only 2 problems. They, or at least John, were adamant that the director had to be Stanley Kubrick, but Kubrick turned the project down, believing the book or books plural were unfilmable, and secondly, Tolkien himself controlled the rights and had no love for the Beatles, and quickly turned them down without batting an eye, so to speak. But that's it. I'm tired. As always, thank you for listening.